Hi, Vincent. Welcome to our Healed in the Hierarchy podcast, where we discuss the experiences and challenges faced by working women today. Join us as we explore a range of topics from navigating career advancement to balancing work and personal life. So step into an episode of Healed in the Hierarchy, the place where we explore current challenges and opportunities and share extraordinary insights for ordinary women, one conversation at a time.
So today we're going to talk about how to shape the next generation of female leaders in 4 steps by Gaelle Deschamps. Okay. I came across the TED when we see part of our series. We always do a TED talk, and it was just really interesting because a lot of the podcasts, conversations we've had, I've been mindful that when we're talking about leadership in the next step, sometimes I put in experience and thinking about my daughter or, what's the next generation, and came across this, which I thought hopefully, especially for our listeners, anyone, if you're a sister, if you're an aunt, if you're a mentor, if you're a coach, if you're a mother, if you're an aunt, we all have people in our lives that are female that actually I don't know whether I would know to challenge myself to think about talking to them about specific leadership qualities. What was quite nice about listening to this TED Talk was it was both factual in terms of giving quite, for me anyway, quite wow, I didn't realise that was the issue. She talked very much about going upstream and finding the cause of the problem, but also I'm very practical. So gave practical tools to how you would support and talk about leadership in that TED Talk.
I thought what was interesting was something that she said about 3/4 of the way through about thinking differently about the alpha-loaded definitions of what leadership is. And that was the first time I'd really thought so many of the definitions of leadership, when I've done management and leadership development training in the past, when I've led training and when I've been a delegate, it is actually very male focused. It's about having gravitas. It's about having gravitas.
Listeners could see you.
But it is. It's about having presence. It's performative, and it is incredibly alpha focused. And that genuinely had never occurred to me. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And we'll go through our perspectives on the TED Talk as we were watching it. So we'll go through it sort of fairly logically. But that was just for me a real eureka moment, because if we're trying to help shape women as leaders, and the cookie cutter shape that we've talked about before, trying to fit women into this predetermined mold of what leadership is, I think it's just so male. And women, as we have talked about in the past, are often criticised when they demonstrate either quite female traits, or if they don't demonstrate leadership in enough of a male-focused way.
Yeah, definitely. It's quite interesting, actually. No matter what topic we talk about, it gravitates back to this quite a lot, about these subtle ways in terms of business, work, life, that still, when we kind of looking at any topic, and yet sometimes the gender bias is always revealed in some way. The gender gap in terms of work is always revealed. And also, unfortunately, the sad thing for me is constantly reminded that we're still not even there yet.
Yeah,
we pretend we're in a culture where we're equal in terms of the perspective of we have jobs, we can train is what we like. But in reality, when we're looking at stats, specifically on this TED Talk, it always comes back to we still haven't shifted that needle to make it different. Does that make sense? Okay, so if we go back to the way that the TED Talk starts, I really like sometimes being framed with facts, because it makes me feel like, oh, I'm interested in that topic, but I didn't really realise the reality of that topic. So Gaelle, she talks about how from the research, there's 134 years to close the generation gap. That's huge. And she's saying about that's 5 generations, and actually how the myths of basically somebody else's job to bring up your daughter to think about leadership. And then when she looks about the Oxford Economic Journal that talks about proportions, the stats of the real issue about any females that drop out of even having, or opt out, she talked about it, and she should opt out of even thinking as a leader, as their future self, was 39%.
Yeah, their willingness to be a leader,
or even thinking about it
between birth and adolescence goes down 39%, and yet with boys it remains the same.
Absolutely, doesn't change
at all. And it's interesting because that's probably because even from a very young age, the use of male focused qualities in descriptors about leadership they're already tuned to that.
I was surprised because later on she talks about people that's in your life, that's around you. I was thinking, well, a lot of the primary school or secondary schools are female, so they technically would be leaders. So what is it that makes them think? So it was talking really about some of the reasons around it, which has actually made me quite sad about why, some of the reasons why it would be so low. And actually looking upstream, I really like that term, that when we're trying to change or look at something in a specific way, you've got to look upstream to where the source of the problem starts, which is where this stat comes from, when they're looking about what is it, when is it that females stop thinking in a way that they could potentially be a leader in any way. And obviously that's what she was saying about teenagehood. And then she was talking about the willingness dropped so much from child adolescence because of self-esteem, body image, hormones, and actually they don't identify with the leaders they want to see or be. And that's a thought process of going, yeah, I had people thinking about personally, if they do practically, there was a lot of females in the school, but I suppose in that perspective, you see in your own viewpoint, not necessarily about the people in leadership are still very male dominated roles, aren't they?
Yeah.
So it's almost an unconscious bias that you rule yourself out because you don't identify with that. And actually made me sad to think the fact that the research showed that boys had absolutely no change in their perspective of whether they is absolutely clear to me that it absolutely is a gender issue, which is more scary to me thinking my daughter is a teenager.
Yeah.
And I can guarantee you that she hasn't even thought about it.
Yeah.
Like in the TED Talk, leadership isn't on the curriculum.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily speak about, they do life skills and they talk about things around sexual orientation and they talk about a knife crime, for example. But the things that change the next generation is when they go into work, isn't it? What's the business world like? Or they do business studies, but they don't talk about being an entrepreneur or thinking creatively. Whereas, I don't know about you, but if you look at the generation of things that people use as social media, thinking about, a lot of it is people, either if it's on social media, being entrepreneurs, thinking differently.
Yeah.
Not necessarily a specific job title with influencers and things like that. So it did make me think about being relevant when she talks about the leaders and the people that they would see at their age. And that's potentially why they kind of ruled themselves out.
And some of it is around the you can't be what you can't see perspective. I think for boys, their views on leadership remain the same. Their leadership willingness, she called it, because they see male role models of leadership in every walk of life. And because women are playing catch up, they see fewer examples, which is why it's going to take 5 generations to redress the balance, to make it more of a 50-50 proportion of leaders to reflect the proportion of male versus female in society. So I think one of the points that she makes, which I think is really key, is that we as women, mothers, daughters, sisters, aunts, colleagues, we can be those change agents ourselves, and we can encourage women in leadership, no, females in leadership. I think we have to be careful. So one of the things that comes to mind when we were thinking about the name of this podcast, we often came up with ideas that featured the word women in it. You know, women in leadership was one of the things that we toyed with as an idea for the name of the podcast. We need to think about a term that addresses all of the transitions that females make throughout their life. Because women in leadership, they're already anchored there because of their age. So for the transition from being girls to women.
Yeah. But I think you're right. I think the main point is the fact that when we talk about women leadership, you're kind of saying that they're already established, they're already in the work life. And actually the whole point of her perspective was this problem starts a lot earlier in teenagehood, which actually was the point that going, so that's where we need to target, was a point, isn't it? So how do we inspire people to be trailblazers?
And
how
even
do we
before
get them,
then,
in children in schools?
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting saying that myth of people already got people that it's other people to talk about it, but there's no curriculum. If you, as a mother or a carer or an aunt, a sister, is the person they see majority of the time, then you have the most influence in terms of how they not only portray this as a female, but actually when you have conversations to engage them with in terms of what's your perspective of X, Y, and Z. I really liked the lead her steps, but near the end, it's very much that may we know them, may we be them, and may we raise them.
Yeah, really powerful.
And I thought, what an impact is that? That we should surround ourselves with people that really have good conversations, less about all the worry about social media, but it was very much around how do we get people together to talk about how do we solve the problem? How do we have people that we know, people that are aspiring to have conversations? May we authentically embody the qualities we want to discuss with younger generations, and let us be bolder in raising women who have got those qualities and skill sets. And what was interesting, I don't know if it was interesting to you, but is in the home, you're always going to have conflict, right?
Mm-hmm.
And actually what she was pointing out is every opportunity in conflict is an opportunity to teach.
Yep.
And so I'm just thinking of a teenage daughter and teenagers generally and their hormones, and there's always going to be conflict, right? And her perspective of if you change your mindset in thinking about your approach, is staying calm. You as the parent or carer or auntie or, in the middle of that conflict, instead of going into it in the conflict, thinking about there's an opportunity to show them how to conflict resolute in a leadership way.
Mm-hmm.
So help stay calm, listening to understand, think about how you want to resolve them, encourage them to communicate clearly, because obviously when you're in a heightened stage, it's hard to communicate well anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that then mirrors some of that when they go in the workplace or you've been emotional.
Yeah.
Right. So it just made me think at that point that actually that's a great opportunity to how do you communicate even though you're feeling quite heightened. And then how do you allow them to come to a resolution and then really praise them when you see those qualities or when they're doing those things as a way to practice in your everyday.
One of the other things that she talks about is that leadership comes in many shapes and forms. And so picking up on your point about kind of like teaching opportunities throughout a female's life, that can be really, really powerful, because by seeing those teaching moments, you are reinforcing the fact that leadership comes in many shapes and forms, of which being female is a perfectly legitimate shape or form, because we stop ourselves sometimes because of the fear of being seen as being emotional. Because when I get frustrated, I'm more likely to cry or to say, fine, and then wander off when I'm clearly not fine.
Yeah.
Or to close down, or to have a very emotional response that I'm sure is magnified, because in my subconscious, I'm also angry with the fact that that is not what a man would do in the same circumstance, or, sort of comparing myself unfavorably to other people or other contexts. So I then have this dual narrative. And I think it is just giving females the permission that actually our female qualities are allowed, because leadership comes in many shapes and forms. And going back to your point about looking for those opportunities to really sort of develop and reinforce leadership qualities, it's about encouraging the female to find their voice, to create a safe space for them to explore their leadership skills and capabilities. And by not saying, but you can't cry, because what we're doing is we're trying to turn the tide of what was happening before. If there are so many male leaders, and if we've got alpha loaded definitions and alpha loaded role models, we can't just have 50% ratio of male to female leaders, but have them all demonstrating male leadership traits. We have to shift that balance to say that female emotions, female traits are perfectly acceptable. And I think that goes to that point about organizations are much more effective, get better outcomes, are less likely to suffer from poor risk management, capital R and lowercase r, and get better financial outcomes when there's a balance between male and female on the boards and in those executive leadership teams. So we can't have 50% balance, but 100% male traits. So we have to educate males and females that the female traits are valid, because leadership comes in many shapes and forms.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's the point. The point is that it's a multi-layered issue that I think not only do we know now that it starts so early on that when kind of teenagers decide it's not for them. It's not only about leading by example, but very much around it's a multi-layered issue. We also have to be conscious that we then don't become our own biases a little bit, like you're saying. So, how sometimes we have generational things in families. So you remember things that you say to your children that your mother said.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what you're saying, that actually we've got to be careful not to try and have people that are just on the board for being a woman without actually embracing their authentic self for being a woman. And how we do that is embracing from a really early age about being the example, not trying to shut down someone for being emotional.
Yeah, exactly.
But finding a way to navigate that emotion into communication. So it's about, like, for example, if they're getting emotional, say, I really noticed that's actually really important to you because you're being emotional.
Yeah.
And then skilling them to regulate. So it's not the emotion speaking, but they can still communicate even though they're feeling anger, upset, frustration.
But also, men and boys know the variety of emotions that women express in every single walk of life, except at work, it seems, where we just have a hole where female emotion can't express itself freely in that particular environment because it is seen as weak or emotional. And yet the very people who are criticizing women for coming across as weak and emotional go home to, they have females in their lives who have all of those emotions that they are expressing freely in other contexts and not being judged for it.
But I think that demonstrates their own weakness.
Yeah.
It's not a strength at all. I would argue that actually they are missing a nurturing element there. Be whoever you are, work and play. Whereas they potentially, and this obviously we're just going from what we have experienced, and it's not a blanket assumption by any means. I'm sure there's some very different perspectives on the table, but there is that element around that's what they've put on themselves as an expectation. And it's a bit like not everyone's alpha male.
No.
But they've learned that actually to succeed is X, Y, and Z. Or they mirror other things, which is a mask for what they need their job to do. Whereas we're in a generation where we're trying to celebrate and authenticate because we know the harm that does when you put your mask on for too long and you're not able to be authentic in who you are.
Yeah.
But what I think this is offering a little bit is how do we do both? How do we have those conflicts, enabling a child or a teenage daughter to express themselves wholeheartedly whilst helping them to see what they're doing as an outcome to a skill. So they're not born leaders, we're not born leaders, but you can grow by learning those skills, which what you're saying is we don't want to stop them being expressionable, if that's a word, but we want to use it, shape those skills to be able to lead well.
I also like when she said about making leadership cool for girls.
Oh, I must have missed that.
I thought that was a really nice way of putting it, because again, that speaks to being allowed to be your authentic and complete self, but also by seeing a diverse range of really brilliant women leaders. And we actually have an episode about inspirational women's leaders in our back catalogue, and we're going to do an update about other inspirational women leaders. So we're going to keep that fresh. But it's that point of having that sort of being what you can see and encouraging females throughout their lives. Dora the Explorer is a leader. Let's really emphasize the leadership qualities of Dora the Explorer.
Taking
risks and being adventurous at an age-appropriate level, although, to be fair, Dora the Explorer is appropriate for any age. But one of the other things that I thought was powerful as well is that between birth and when our daughter is 18, we spend 47,340 hours with them.
Doesn't seem a lot, does it?
I think that was quite a big number.
I feel that's probably just a teenagehood. I think you just feel you're spending that much time living with that teenager.
I can't do it with this. No, but
it's a long time.
It's a lot of time, but it's like utilise it,
I think that emphasises the myth that it's everyone else's problem to talk about those things, or actually the whole point is you're the most influential person.
Yes.
You could bring back to that whole point of conflict resolution and shaping how they can do that in a different way. That's more of a leadership rather than a self-deprivation way. And I really liked that it was all quite relatable, even though it's in the face a little bit.
Because she said leadership can be taught. It's not age-related. You're never too young and it's never too late. And that goes back to that point I was making earlier on when we were talking about women in leadership. If the females in our lives are never too young, and we relate Dora the Explorer and other young people, those people, young female role models throughout the 47,500 hours. I've lost my train of thought.
But how impactful that would be.
That would be really,
I mean, I like the fact that she then led on to the lead her approach or lead her approach, because it's exactly what we're saying. L is for the lead by example. So you need to plant the seed. So you talk about calculated risk. You talk about shared vision of leadership. You think about what comes to mind about it being a servant-hearted, bold leader, what that looks like. I mean, I think about it's related to us, really. I think if we think about this podcast, it's not something that we'd think we're leading by example to our daughters in any way. But I think it's one of those things that I know what we've talked about is, well, you've not just talked about it, you've gone and done it. You're talking about the topic. You know, I have conversations around what we're talking about, why it's important. So even unconsciously, you're leading by example. You know, the fact that we've got businesses and we're taking our own initiative and what we do with that and growing that. Although there's a lot of problems with that in terms of it's our responsibility and the buck stays with us, that's still, without thinking, we're leading people to lead in our daughters and our people around us to be the example we talk about. You know, we're not just going, oh, this is really good to take risks and talk about this topic, but don't do anything about it because we think it's somebody else's responsibility to do it, or we write a letter to the MP saying you should do this. We are then creating our own content to talk about this and using the platform. So we can tick that off. Well done.
Yes.
But it's interesting because I think some of these things are, when I was thinking about it, going, well, yeah, these are self-explanatory, but if they did it in the school context as well as the home context, it would be really powerful. If they were having a forum, for example, an after-school club or a lunch club, or even in their school time in the morning, where form is 15, 20 minutes of just sitting there doing absolutely nothing with their form teachers, but they had some thought-provoking questions or ask around the table, you know, what's important in that you would love to see differently? How would you do that? Asking quite interesting questions to get a conversation. That would help them to think differently rather than just scrolling all day, you know, so trying to lead by example. The E was around encouraging leadership skills. I think, you know, we started talking about that. It's about the qualities. What do you think about the 8-to-1 scenario about you need to be the 8-to-1 in terms of praise, showing up, listening to understand, helping people to speak publicly?
That is really important. And we know from other skills that we've developed the importance of that 8-to-1 ratio of positive to negative feedback in any context. And the related thing to that is around the importance of words that we use about ourselves or to other people. And thinking, for example, about risk and how often women will talk themselves out of something because of potential conditioning of failure or a lack of confidence or something similar. If we do nothing at all, there's zero risk, but there's zero progress. And so in being mindful about the words that we use, we can help our daughters and other females to reframe possibility. So even when we're doing that feedback, we can still give that positive 8-to-1 ratio, but by careful thought about the words that we are using in that moment. So we're not validating poor performance or poor behavior, but we can reframe a negative behavior into something more positive by careful choice of words. And if those words have a leadership behavior associated with them, that's not necessarily an alpha term, then that again shows the diversity of qualities that are important to leadership. So it might be something about effective communication, or that was good problem solving, or
it's hard though to stick. I hear you say that, like, yeah. And I remember when the kids were little, and I was really like, it's about praising the behaviour you want to see. Right? So yours, I really like the way you were able to share there. That's really great expression of, you know, that feeling, or, you know, your praise about, thank you for doing that. It was really helpful. All those kind of things. But in reality, again, I know this is going to come on a little bit of a tangent, but it's us doing the work again.
Yes.
We're having to think about what we say and the intention behind it. We're trying to grow, we're trying to learn, but it is on us because that's what we're trying to do.
It's a bit shit being a grown-up, isn't it?
Pressure. I'm remembering all these things. The pressure of going it all. Because I always laugh with my girlfriends about, let's be honest, we're all going to mess up our kids in some way, right? Because it doesn't matter how much you do things, you innately inherit some traits that aren't great. And you have to laugh about it, going, you're turning into your mother. But that is what makes the difference.
Yeah.
And so I think as long as we start going in your friendship group, you go, it's so flipping hard, this whole thing, because we should be doing it in the first place. We shouldn't have to do it. Yeah. Generations allowed it to happen, right? But these are the things that can absolutely shape your child's thinking, because what they experience around the world is not just external, but it's internal, and they absorb and embody some of those things that you say about them or over them, which then can damage or empower them, isn't it? So,
but if we don't do it, we'll always be 5 generations away.
Exactly.
And our daughters will develop leaders as well.
Exactly. But it doesn't make it, sometimes it's good to have these conversations. It has to have these conversations. We do want to make something about it. We want to be able to discussing, but we also have to do the reality of going, flip's sake, we're back here again. This is hard work. It's hard graft. Yeah. But it's the same thing as parenthood.
Yeah.
It's hard
and if
graft.
we don't do it.
But if we do it well at the early ages when they all have these behaviours, then by the time they're older, you're not having a rod for your back because you've nipped it in the bud. So,
exactly.
Yes,
exactly. But lead by example and then encouraging leadership qualities.
And then the aim is to ask questions, which I think we've kind of talked about, is around, you engage those leadership questions. So what is the top 3 values? What do you think about the world needs most at the moment? It talks about practicing debating. Well, I've never had to debate, I don't think, probably apart from bartering or, negotiating with a child, but not necessarily. I hated debating at school or thinking of something. No, we'll do that. But it's about creating a safe space in order to create connections or exploration, isn't it? So you're asking them not to get an answer, you're asking them to understand and helping them to think outside of their perspectives.
And helping them to find their voice as well.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think that's really key. And then the D was define leadership inclusively. What was your take on what that means?
Again, it's about sharing vision, the ideas, about supporting somebody thinking about a project or something. So identify going back to your very, very first point about redefining that mold, a gingerbread mold. So what would be a great leader for you might be different to everybody else. That doesn't mean it's different. It means it's wrong. It just means if you use those questions to define leadership, it's about enabling them, the next generation, to see it as a skill that they want to become. So you don't have to be in a leadership in a CEO position, but you can be a leader in your scout group, or you can you can run a project at your school and be able to not take things personally if someone doesn't have your perspective, but help them to listen, to understand, and then praise somebody to then get the project done. There's different leadership skills within that, isn't there? And helping someone to define leadership in a way that will change that needle.
There is this constant search for the perfect definition of leadership. And last time I checked, there were 3.5 million plus books available on leadership. And not one of them has come up with the definitive, perfect definition of a leader. It does not exist because leadership is going to change depending on the environment that we're in at the moment, the people that we're with, the weather, the 100 different variables in any given moment. So again, I've sort of lost my train of thought a little bit. But
I agree with you. It can't be defined. So when they talk about defined leadership, it's what's it's identify what's important. So you take on leadership, but also if you think about it, one of the reasons you can't find an exact, this is your gingerbread mold that you should be, is the fact that we're complex human beings.
Yeah.
And we interact. So actually to be a leader, you need social intelligence to start with. And that is very difficult in the first place. There's so many different factors, is what you're saying, around the culture, the environment, the sector that you work in, everything else that. But it is about the person. So I think you can teach skills, but you've got to be able to embody and create it. You don't want a robot leader that gives you all the right answers but doesn't have any personality.
So you're using inclusive language around what leadership is. So you're not really defining it. And then you're also making sure that because leadership comes in many shapes and forms, leadership is a way of being. And if you've got the qualities that you can adapt to the situation, then you will always be demonstrating leadership. Because you've got that flexibility, you've got a range of qualities and behaviors and ways of thinking in your toolbox. So I'm now concluding that leadership isn't a definition. It's not a finite thing. It's not going to be in the 4 millionth book on leadership. Leadership is a toolbox of values and behaviors that you select from depending on the circumstance as presented to you in that moment. That's bloody good. I'm going to write a book on that.
There is that element about how do we lead her to be a leader, and maybe know them, surrounding ourselves with people that can be inspirational, not for the outcome. This is specific. It's not about, whereas I think that's the difference between men. They want the outcome, they want the result. What we're talking about is being a leader that leads to progress, to develop, to be inspirational, no matter what the outcome is, because they want to create a better world. We may want to be them. So our challenge to ourselves is, are we doing those things? Are we having conversations? Are we bold? Are we able to phrase the behavior we want to see, or problem solve and conflict resolute properly with our children or our nieces, etc.? And may we raise them? So the responsibility is around having those initial awareness that actually that is the problem, is starting in the children's childhood, not when they go to work. And I think that's the biggest eye opener for me is, of course, but actually it's not something that I really thought about as a teenager. My world was not around work or thinking about being a leader. But I wonder whether my thinking around my aspirations would have shifted, or my role models and if they were part of those conversations. I don't know. But I absolutely feel like if we do want to change that generational gap, we need to start thinking, and not just thinking, but just doing, about conversations, being bolder, having more open questions, because actually it's not about us, it's about helping their thinking and their processing, and being curious about what their thinking is. Because often that's the point. Critical thinking is quite difficult to teach.
And so important today.
But it's so important. And so I think that TED Talk really was why I thought it was so important to kind of bring back to the table, because it was very much relevant. We talk about leadership in all different ways. It's funny that it goes back to the gender bias again, and gingerbread men, and how we mould ourselves to be that leader that is not even authentically female anyway. But I also like the fact, in listening to the TED Talk together, having different perspectives, but also it had a practical guide that I would say some of them I do, but I'm probably not aware of it.
Yeah.
So how would I make sure that I lead her in those conversations, in those 4 steps? I think that's really practical. Any final kind of takeaways or thinking from you?
I think what was powerful was the alpha loaded definitions and the importance for anyone influential in or with connections with other females from all ages is to be conscious of those alpha loaded definitions and to take away the machismo associated with them, just to be conscious of them. We talked about leading by example, encouraging leadership qualities, asking questions and defining leadership inclusively. And I think my takeaway is to be more intentional about encouraging leadership behaviours in females of all ages at every opportunity we possibly can.
Mm. So I have a question for our listeners. From our takeaways and reading that, my question to you, our listeners, would be, what is your perspective on, please go and listen to the TED Talk and let us know your thoughts. What are you going to be intentionally thinking about and discussing when it comes to changing the next generation to be female leaders?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Because I don't think this just ends there.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear, but I think that's my challenging question to our listeners.
Yeah. So drop us a line with your thoughts.
Yeah, comment, let us know, so that obviously we can come back and revisit your perspectives.
Brilliant.
Soundstripe.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed, please download the podcast on any of your platforms that you listen on. Share, like and follow so others can enjoy. Until next time, keep your heels high and your standards higher.